Okay, all right. Can you hear us now, Justin? 1-1. I think it works now, yes? Hi, Justin. 1-1. Can you hear us? Yes, perfect, finally. All right, all set up. Okay. Once again, thank you so much, Mr. Justin Drake, for joining us today here virtually. And despite not being able to join us in person, we're very excited for your presentation and insights on Ethereum. Thank you so much. Sorry, I think we're still not quite with the audio. Sorry. Just one more moment. Sorry, Justin. Okay. Can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, all works. The panel is yours, Justin.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me, and thank you for the organizers. So today I'd like to talk about Ethereum pre-confirmations, which I think is a very low-hanging fruit in Ethereum land, because it's infrastructure that's very close to the consensus layer, but not actually enshrined in the consensus layer. So it's infrastructure that allows to effectively simulate extremely small block times, even faster than Solana. So Solana has 400 milliseconds block times. With pre-confirmations, you can effectively get 100 millisecond block times from the point of view of the user. And I'm going to be basically splitting the talk into two parts, and there should also be time for questions at the end. Let me know. Sorry, I'm hearing a lot of. Is it okay if I just do on my end? Okay, I'll just turn off the audio on my end.
Can you? Hi. Can you hear us?
So there's going to be two parts to my talk. One, decentralized pre-confirmations. Basically, how do we get pre-confirmations in a decentralized way? And then in part two, I'd like to talk about a specific type of decentralized pre-confirmations, which I call base pre-confirmations. Okay, so let me just check that the organizers don't need to get in touch with me and everything is okay, because I can't hear you guys.
Everything works now, Justin. Thank you. You can continue with your.
So the way that centralized pre-confirmations work today, for example, on Base or on Arbitrum, on Optimism, is that there is this centralized entity, the sequencer. I use the emoji 1, 2, 3, 4 because you're sequencing and ordering transactions. The way that as a user you get this really fast instant pre-confirmation is by sending a direct request. So this is a direct connection between the user and the sequencer. And the sequencer basically makes a promise to include your transaction at a specific point in the block. So for example, if you're making a Uniswap trade, then you know immediately what your execution price is and how much you've paid in gas. And this is what you really care about as a user. Now, in a decentralized setting, things become a little bit more complicated, but not that much more complicated. So what I expect will happen is that these rollups that are now running centralized sequencers will eventually run decentralized sequencers, where at any given slot there is a different entity doing the sequencing. So here we have slot n plus 1, and there's this notion of a look ahead, meaning that as a user, I know who will be the next sequencers for the next few slots. And so as a user, what I can do is I can just contact the next sequencer at slot n, and it's the same kind of flow. There's a request to this sequencer, and then a promise which is returned. All of this within a, because that's how fast it spreads on the internet. Now, one of the very important things is that these sequencers be staked. They need to have some sort of financial collateral, because they're making promises, but there is a possibility that they don't honor their promises, that they renege the pre-confirmations. So let's look at this a little bit more deeply. So if there is a promise that was made and there is a user that had a promise that was not honored, then what we want to do is slash the sequencer. And there's basically two types of failures that can happen. One is this idea of a safety fault, and the other one is a liveness fault. So safety fault means that the sequencer promised to include your transaction, but included a different transaction. So this is something that, as an honest sequencer, should never happen. And so this is something that is safe to slash. The other type of failure is what's called a liveness fault, which is basically when the sequencer promised to include your transaction, but a few milliseconds later, when it was time for them to build the block, that actually led to they actually go offline, and that leads to a liveness fault. So that's something that shouldn't happen very often, but if it does happen, again, we need to slash. Now, this is getting into like technical details, but if we have pre-confirmations, basically promises that are made by the sequencer, then how is the sequencer going to honor those promises in the context of proposer-builder separation? So today we have something called MEV Boost, which is a form of proposer-builder separation. And the way it works is that the sequencer has no constraints on the block. They say, okay, build me, the builders, please build me the best block that you can with the most amount of MEV. And the flow works as follows. Blocks are sent from builders to relays, and then from the relays to the sequencer. But now we have constraints that come from the user pre-confirmation. So the users have this deal with the sequencer that their transactions will be included and executed in a given way. And then these constraints need to be communicated to the builders. So they naturally get communicated through the relays. And then the builders, their job is to build the best block possible with the constraints of the pre-confirmations. So as an example, the pre-confirmations might constrain the top of the block, and then the builders have to build the best bottom of block that they can, that extracts the most MEV with the constraint of this top of block. So here's a little bit of a table summarizing decentralized and centralized pre-confirmations. And I think it's going to be a relatively easy transition from one to the other. In a centralized pre-confirmation setting that we have today, you have a fixed sequencer. And in a decentralized setting, you have a rotating sequencer at every single slot. The slashing is slightly different. So today, the slashing for centralized sequencers is based on reputation. The teams running centralized operators are, for example, Optimism Labs or the off-chain labs or Coinbase, and they have a lot of reputation at stake. On the other hand, slashing in a decentralized setting is financial. And then one thing which is actually also quite different is how you can handle MEV. So in a centralized setting, you can have a policy that is kind of human-driven. So for example, the human operator behind the sequencer can say, I promise to order your transactions first come, first serve, and I also promise to not front run you and not sandwich you. But in a decentralized setting, you can't trust the entities. And so you have more of a market-based economics approach, closer to proposer-builder separation. And if you want MEV protection, which is something I think we will want, then you need something like encrypted mempools. Okay, part two is around a specific type of sequencing, which I call base sequencing, where the layer one itself, Ethereum, is doing the pre-confirmations for the rollups. So we all know that Ethereum can be used for settlement. We all know that it can also be used as data availability. These are modules that are reusable by rollups. But it turns out, hiding in plain sight, there is this third module, which is sequencing. So the Ethereum chain today uses L1 proposers to sequence EVM transactions. And it turns out these same proposers can also be given rights to sequence roll-up transactions. And that has all sorts of benefits, which are the following. One is that you inherit, as a sequencer, the security of the L1. You also inherit its credible neutrality. And you also enjoy some of the network effects that comes from composability. So just to go through them real quick, security is very important in the context of sequencing for liveness. So if you have a decentralized sequencer, which is some sort of off-chain consensus with a new token, you're now introducing a new 51% attack vector. And as an attacker, if I take over your sequencer, I can do two bad things. Bad thing number one is that I can force every user to use the escape hatch, and I'm basically killing your rollup. All the users leave your rollup, and now they're going to go to some competitor's rollup. And then the other big thing that they can do is they can harvest MEV, toxic MEV for a period of time. So they for let's say 1 hour or 1 day. This depends on the timeout that's configured to activate the escape hatch. Let's say it's 1 hour. Well, for a whole hour, this attacker can censor oracles, manipulate markets, and basically harvest toxic MEV. Another really important aspect of sequencing, in my opinion, is this idea of credible neutrality. And the reason is that more and more we're realizing that there is a tremendous value from shared sequencing. Shared sequencing means that rollups opt into using the exact same sequencer so that they can have better composability and interoperability across the rollups. And so in order for the rollups to agree to opt into a shared sequencer, it needs to be credibly neutral. So for example, if Arbitrum was to create a shared sequencer and ask Optimism to join, well, would Optimism want to join? Probably not, because it's built by their competitor. And so we want to be in a position where we have these very credibly neutral shared sequencers. And Ethereum is, in some sense, the most credibly neutral platform there is for Ethereum rollups, because rollups have already opted in to Ethereum. And then finally, there's this idea of layer one composability. So the L1 today has about $500 billion of TVL, which is more than an order of magnitude than Arbitrum, which is the rollup with the most TVL. And if you opt into base sequencing, then you enjoy the synchronous composability with the L1. Okay, so how can we basically use the L1 proposers as sequencers with pre-confirmations for rollups? Well, the idea is actually quite similar to decentralized sequencing. The idea is that there's going to be some subset of L1 proposers that are going to be collateralized. So those are the ones in green. They opt in to becoming sequencers, hence the emoji 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the L1 sequencers that are not collateralized, we're just going to call them includers. And the sequencing rights from the point of view of the rollups will be given to those sequencers in green. Now, as a user, what I need to do if I want a pre-confirmation is just contact the next sequencer here at slot n+1, get a promise. This is the exact same flow. And this pre-confirmation comes in 100 milliseconds, but you may ask, what about the settlement latency? I get my pre-confirmation very fast, but I will also want my transaction to be included on-chain very, very fast. And this is where the includers come in. So the includers here, even though they don't have sequencing rights, they don't have the right to order transactions, they do have the right to settle and include transactions on-chain. So all the pre-confirmed transactions by this sequencer can be immediately included in slot N. And so in this design, you basically have best-in-class pre-confirmation latency, but also best-in-class settlement latency of the next slot. Now, one of the things that you might be wondering in this picture here is that if the sequencer is an L1 proposer, isn't that really, really bad for decentralization, right? Because we want the L1 proposers that are currently validators to be running on Raspberry Pis with a home internet connection. And the answer is yes. This is actually a bad design. And there's two solutions. Solution number one involves a hard fork, which is called execution tickets. And the idea of execution tickets is that the validators are no longer responsible for sequencing. So instead, sequencing is opened up to the market. And as a validator, my main role is to make attestations, which are extremely easy to do. And so the sequencer would be assumed to be a sophisticated entity that can handle pre-confirmations for all rollups and all users simultaneously. And then there's another short-term viable solution, in my opinion, which is basically delegation. So you have the sequencer here, which is an L1 proposer running on a Raspberry Pi, and they are going to delegate their sequencing rights to this new entity, which I'm calling a gateway. And this is a sophisticated entity, similar to a relay, or it could even be a relay itself, that is going to be doing the sequencing on behalf of the sequencer. So users here, you see, they connect directly with the relay. They don't even talk to the sequencer. Now, it turns out that there's quite a bit of movement recently in this direction of moving towards shared sequencing and specifically base sequencing. So there's now 3 different rollups that have publicly committed to becoming base rollups. There's Tyco, there's a key value rollup that Coinbase is building, and there's also one called Rise. And then there's 3 other rollups or projects that I know of that are actively considering becoming a base rollup, especially the first 2 here. So we have Aztec, which I'd say is much more likely than not to become a base rollup. And then there's this other top rollup here, one of the top rollups in production on mainnet, which I expect, based on discussions with their team, to also become a base rollup. And then there's projects like ENS here, where they want maximum credible neutrality. If they were to move to an L2, they can't choose Arbitrum, otherwise they upset Optimism, and they can't choose Optimism, otherwise they upset Arbitrum. And so the best solution for them is probably to launch as their own standalone based rollup that is maximally credibly neutral. Now, the name of the summit here is hack.summit. So if there are hackers in the room, it turns out that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit for people to start building this pre-confirmation infrastructure. And actually, there's 7 teams here on the bottom in green that have started building these initial specs, initial research, initial proof of concept implementations. And if you're interested in trying to help Ethereum achieve this real-time user experience of 100 millisecond pre-confirmations in a decentralized setting, do get in touch with me. So that's the end of my talk, and if audio permits, we can have questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin, for your exciting presentation on the Ethereum ecosystem. And thank you once again for joining us virtually. Oh yeah, the sounds should be fine. Yeah, all good. Thank you once again for joining us virtually here today. We appreciate your long distance support towards our summit.